Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for another poetry discussion. A poetry discussion that comes to us from the wild pages of William Blake. Yeah. So this is, my copy is The Complete Poetry and Prose of William Blake, newly revised edition, edited by David V. Erdman, commentary by Harold Bloom, just so I get that out there. And one of the things that you will note about William Blake immediately, if you decide to simply flip through Blake in the same way that I suggest flipping through Emily Dickinson, there's going to be moments where you think you're going through a gunman's notebook. There are moments of Blake that are so lucid, but in a crazy way, that no matter what you make of the poem you are reading or are going to read, you're going to feel a bit debased in the process. And this poem, in no small way, adds to that legend. It is known as the Sick Rose, and adding to the gunman's notebook theory of William Blake, the capital T H E Sick Rose, all caps. Prior to the internet, all caps didn't mean you were trying to look tough online. All caps meant probably you were going to shoot people. So the Sick Rose reads as such: O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Now, this poem is about fiddling the diddle. I think. This poem is about fiddling the diddle. It's, I think, obviously about fiddling the diddle, and I think that it is a poem about the evils of fiddling the diddle, and it's not your fault, but you did it anyway, and here's some capital letters. There's some crazy going on. So, like I did with William Shakespeare and Billy Wigglestick, I have a line-by-line translation sort of into this interpretation, and I will bring it to you, but I'm having trouble with William Blake, Billy Wigglestick. William Shakespeare into Billy Wigglestick works because it's goofy, right? You were taking William Shakespeare, one of the most renowned authors of all time, and translating it into something goofy that sounded goofy. Billy, William, Shakespeare, Wiggle, Stick. Okay, simple enough. Goofy. I don't know how to translate William Blake into something that sounds gunman enough. William Blake, I'm thinking maybe Billiam Blade, something like that, but I don't know yet. So, O rose, thou art sick. Pretty young thing, you ain't right. Line 2, the invisible worm, or the indelible force of lust. Line 3, that flies in the night, translates to that hits during loneliest night. Line 3, in the howling storm, or when forceful time for fantasy foils. Line 5, has found out thy bed, or has been these fantasies striking you. 6 of crimson joy, or questionably during times of lady strife. Line 7, and his dark secret love, or and the proposition of diddling the fiddle. And the final line, does thy life destroy? 8 will bring you ruin. So, having fantasies, sexual fantasies, which lead to your diddling, will ruin your life. This is not an uncommon belief for someone so religiously strident, maybe that should be a word, religiously strident as a William Blake or a Billiam Blade. Often, however, the interpretation of this poem, now I think that interpretation's right out there. Maybe just got a mind for the wicked. Often, the interpretation of this poem is made to say there is an innocent interpretation of this poem to be made, saying simply that the selfish part of love corrupts the endeavor. The selfish part of love is the undoing. Not the lust part of love, but the selfish, the unctuously selfish and wanting part of love is what will lead to the ruin of the person, the individual, not just the relationship, but the entire individual. However, I think that is a very innocent interpretation of this poem, right? I think that is a very non-sin related interpretation of this poem. But this is not Songs of Innocence. This is from the section Songs of Experience. Learning from experience in something like that might lead to an interpretation of more carnal thoughts, more carnal endeavors. That said, all of that said, I'm going to read this poem one more time, straight through, and then I'm going to read the Billiam Blade interpretation straight through, and I want you to listen for an ethereal pointing finger. Where's the finger pointing? Here. The sick rose. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Pretty young thing, you ain't right. The indelible force of lust that hits during loneliest night when fanciful time for fantasy foils has been these fantasies striking you, questionably during times of lady strife? And the proposition of diddling the fiddle will bring you to ruin. So if we assume this is about flicking the bick, because I think that this is pointing towards the rose. The rose here sounds effeminate to me. This sounds like the rose is the embodiment of a young woman suffering from lustful desires of the invisible worm that flies at night. I mean, that's not on the nose. In these readings, and perhaps it's my tone, the tone that I'm bringing, the inflection that I'm bringing to these words, but I don't think so. Where's the blame? Who is at fault? The rose is sick. The rose is not evil. The invisible worm that flies at night in the howling storm, well, there doesn't seem to be any blame there. That invisible worm seems to be a disembodied sort of spirit. Not to blame. You don't blame the birds for chirping. You don't blame the dogs for barking. You don't blame the invisible worm for flying at night and finding your bed in a howling storm. It just does what it does. Has found out thy bed of crimson joy in his dark and secret love. Again, there's no blame there. But despite there not being blame, that final line, does thy life destroy? That's the lesson here for me. This is an Old Testament type of onus. This is an external locus of control. And it doesn't matter, baby, because it can still ruin you. We have so often in today's world this sort of overarching narrative of fairness. We hope for it so bad that we're unwilling to really allow unfairness to exist. We hope for fairness so hard that we're really unwilling for unfairness to exist. We have escaped in the modern world. So many of us have escaped the burden of nature, the burden of consequence for something that was not chosen, right? All of the really bad stuff that can happen in most of our worlds happens because you screwed something up. You went out, you got drunk, and you drove into oncoming traffic. You survived. That family of four did not. You're going to jail for the rest of your life. And rightfully so, right? But you made that choice. It can happen, obviously, but if you were sideswiped, knocked into the oncoming traffic, you survived, the family of four did not. We don't send you to jail for life for that. This poem's worse than that. The implication, like the true unspoken implications here, if it's about diddling the fiddle, I think it is. I don't care what interpretation anyone else has. This is about diddling the fiddle. It's about flicking the bick. The interpretation here is you were sideswiped into oncoming traffic. Boom. Had that accident. And it ruined your life. And your afterlife. Don't forget about that. Don't forget about that here. Don't forget about that in a Christian worldview. It's the forever after. And it's a difficult reading for a modern world because, sure, the Pope still tells people to jerk off, not to jerk off. One of Christopher Hitchens' favorite lines. But outside of that, the entirety of the internet is set up, basically, for flicking the bick. Let's just be honest. And this madness, this feeling like you are in a gunman's notebook, is exacerbated by the poem about the masturbated. But it's not a sentiment that would have been totally lost in his day. It is not at all a sentiment that would have been lost during his time. It's just sort of a sentiment that is lost now. So, can you think of those things that we talk about in this way prohibitively or inclusively? A couple hundred years from now, people are going to read and think, what were these crazy people up to? You know? What are those things that we talk about in sort of, this isn't a casual way. If it is, in fact, about flicking the bick, he had to go through a lot of code switching here to put it in one of his neat, nice little verses. But I think it's there. What are those things that we will write about today? Those norms, those mores that we accept, that we sort of watch over and guard. 250 years from now, someone will look at and think that we were crazy folk. It's just interesting to me, the whole dynamic around this poem. And that idea of the onus. The onus is not on our main character. The consequences are on our main character. That is all I have for, and that's kind of crazy. It feels today. That is all I have for this poetry discussion. Now, got a lot of poetry discussions on the channel, got a lot of poetry discussions in a playlist called the Poetry Discussion Playlist here on the channel. If you have a favorite poem, it's possible that it's already in that playlist. If you are here by chance but not design and are not subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. If you did like this video, consider giving me a thumbs up on this video because it really does help me out here on the channel. And running a channel about literature, talking about poetry, talking about individual poems, not as lucrative as you might think. Maybe help me out. I appreciate you being here.